I saw myself on that stage.
Ladies and gentlemen, Arnold Schwarzenegger!
Thousands of people screaming, Arnold, Arnold, Arnold. And when you visualize something very clearly, you believe that you 100% can get there. There was a lot of things they had to learn, obstacles that they had to overcome. You can get an injury, then all your athletic stuff is over. But the only thing that no one can take from you is your mind.
Arnold Schwarzenegger terminated his box office competition.
I was looking for another challenge. Politics. Let's get to work.
He had no staff, no real plan.
Makeup, please.
He blew up the political system.
There's problems and problems, but I want to do the things that everyone calls impossible.
I'll be back.
People will remember my successes, and they will also remember those failures. It was very tough on my marriage, on my relationship with the kids. I have caused enough pain for my family. I'm gonna have to live with it the rest of my life.
Why did you give up?
Well, because my vision didn't talk about giving up. My vision was climbing that mountain.
He's the guy who turns his boat towards the torpedo.
If you're always hungry, you're never really satisfied. No matter what it takes, work your ass off. Do it. Do it now.
That was the trailer for the new Netflix docu-series, Arnold. And this is Factual America. I'm your host, Matthew Sherwood. Each week I watch a hit documentary and then talk with the filmmakers and their subjects. How do you make a documentary about someone known simply by his first name? Arnold Schwarzenegger certainly needs no introduction. Or does he? In this three-part docuseries, award-winning filmmaker Lesley Chilcott chronicles Arnold's rise from rural post-war Austria to the highest echelons of the American dream. Join us as we talk with Lesley about all of the layers that make Arnold Schwarzenegger such a compelling subject for a documentary, and how she went about revealing the man behind the larger-than-life persona. Prepare yourself for a masterclass in documentary filmmaking. Stay tuned. Lesley Chilcott, welcome to Factual America. How are things with you?
Things are pretty awesome right now, and I'm really happy to be here with you.
Well, I imagine they are pretty awesome. We're talking about your new doc, or docu-series to be more accurate, streaming on Netflix, and it's Arnold. I don't know if I need to say any more than that, but congratulations, and at least here in the UK, which is where we're based, it's the top film on Netflix, certainly the last few days. So you've got a real success story on your hands, but maybe you probably always knew that it was going to be, but I'm sure there were challenges getting there and whatnot. So thanks again.
I did not know that it was going to be, and to hear that it's one in the UK is really cool. I actually didn't know that. Thank you.
Well, at least when I get on, it is. So I think, depending on how these algorithms work, it works. That's what's showing up when I look at it. Now, and it was very kind of you to say you've listened to a few episodes. We usually start off by asking the filmmakers, what is the film about? But it seems kind of funny in this one. What is Arnold about? So maybe we start off with how do you go about making a doc about someone who's known by just one name? We've had like the filmmakers behind Tina, who unfortunately passed away a few weeks ago. But he's one of these interesting characters who's, you say one name and people know automatically who you're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's right. But to be honest with you, when I first got the call about this, I thought, what's not to know? Because Arnold has been such a public figure. I'm from California. He was our governor for 7 years. And this unlikely trajectory is somewhat known. But when I started really thinking about, when a filmmaker decides, what the next project is for them, for me, it has to have at least 4 layers, preferably 6.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But, I'm like, does Arnold have these layers,
Right.
because he's such a public figure. But the fact that he came from such humble beginnings in Austria and then actually decided that bodybuilding, which was an obscure sport then,
Well,
this was the 60s, and he decided that bodybuilding was his way out of Austria. And then I started learning about how he was envisioning things and things that became, very popular later in the 70s, whether it was New Age movement or just general psychology. And he was from this village of broken men because Austria was on the losing side of World War II, and all the kids' fathers were dealing with that because they all fought. And you go from there to, yeah, okay, I can see Arnold making it as far as Conan, right? Because
right.
those characters were supersized comic book, larger than life characters.
Right.
But he did it at a time where you have these actors that were tiny, that were doing really well. And it was sort of more introspective. He's not, as an actor, a particularly introspective, performer.
Mm-hmm.
And then the fact that, we have this mess. And when you're from California, it's so great that we have the recall. But when we do, it is a total mess. It is a total shit show. And, over 130 people entered. We just had it with Gavin Newsom, the people that were entering. It's nuts. And the fact that he turned that, like he always does, into an opportunity, that he used a competition to become governor, not just running against a Democrat or an independent. He was running against all these other people. And, as you'll see in the doc, he's like, I love those guys. We had, Larry Flint, we had a porn star, we had actor Gary Coleman, we had all these people. And he's like, those guys made me look good, and that's how I advanced. So I was like, you know what, there are multiple layers here. And I decided that it could be a very layered, hopefully interesting to people documentary.
I mean, just out of curiosity, you said at least 4, but hopefully 6 layers. Are there definitive layers, or is that more just sort of you need to have a subject that's multi-layered, that there's much, you're going to be doing a lot of peeling of the onion to get to understanding?
This is a good question. I think it's 40% the former and 60% the latter, because a lot of times, especially people that have been professional athletes, their whole MO is to bury all the other things that distract them. And despite Arnold's 3 distinct phases, right? Being an athlete, an actor, and then a politician, it's the athlete training that has guided everything that he has done. But that in that singular focus, I mean, I've met heads of state, all sorts of wonderful people. That laser focus that he has is unparalleled, at least in the people that I have met. But it also makes it a real challenge as a filmmaker, because you gotta get beyond that one thing to get to those other layers. I don't know if that was a very good answer, but it's sort of how I feel.
No, I think it's a great answer, and I think it takes and you're actually giving us some structure to this interview, because I think maybe that's another place to focus, because it is 3 episodes. It fits along with the 3 distinct phases of his life, and but you start with athlete, and I think, as you've already noted, why. I mean, rightfully so. I mean, what is it that we maybe do not know? I mean, for me, like you said, you mentioned Conan the Barbarian already. That's how my first early memories are really of Conan the Barbarian and onward. So I'm too young to remember his bodybuilding era. But there will be some that do. There will be some here who don't even remember or are too young for the movie period. But but what was it? I mean, I think, as you said, there's something more to him than is your typical person saying, I just want to bulk up and I'll be famous, isn't it?
Yeah, I think, for a long time, one of the things Arnold says in the series is, born in Austria, made in America, right? Which was up for consideration as title for a while. as you throw around, what are the as was I'll be back,
Right, of course.
as was, I really wanted that for a while because it perfectly
Right.
exemplifies Arnold, right? Like he spreads his catchphrases virally in a way that cannot be stopped. But it's more than just what we now call a meme. They also become his mantra. The first movie he did, Stay Hungry,
Right.
and he collaborated with the authors on that. That is his mantra to this day. So he has a way of infusing himself like into his characters. So like, you always try and sit back and you're like, what's my thesis for this series or documentary or whatever it is? And this one kept evolving because the obvious thesis with Arnold, and the one that he sincerely feels is the guiding, factor to his life, is with my sense of Austrian discipline. He always says a version of this, combined with American opportunity, I was able to do X, Y, Z, right?
Yeah.
And for me, his actual secret sauce, besides being the most strategic person, one of the most strategic people I've had the chance to work with, is yes, it's the Austrian sense of discipline combined with the opportunity of America, but building a key tribe of people to surround himself with to win the world.
Well, he says that several. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. He always espouses, I'm not a self-made man because I had all of this help in this group of people, but it's really true. And he, in bodybuilding, even when he was 15 years old, he would go down to the lake, the Tallersee Lake, which is beautiful forested area. And all of a sudden there's a lake that's hardly larger than a pond. And they would work out like hanging from the tree branches, doing pull-ups and sit-ups. And someone would bring an old-fashioned barbell that was left there. And then someone drove a spike into a tree later to do pull-ups and other things. And it was always a group. He quickly became the leader of each group, but there was always, he thrives with an audience, but he really listens. I mean, he even listened to me right when we first met, and we didn't know each other well at that point. So I think that's another layer for him. Another layer is these bad dad jokes that you hear him telling all the time. That's really him. He's really that hilarious goofball. It's true.
I'm gonna have to let my children watch because they'll get a kick out of that. Yeah, no, it's that's interesting. So that will get to the obvious question that we'd eventually get to is like, here's this larger than life character. You've now had a chance to work with him for a few years, and is that it's everything you would I guess there are things we would expect, but is there anything else that kind of surprised you when you're working with him?
Yeah, his humor surprised me. The way he structures his day, he's up early in the morning. He actually sleeps less than most people. He sleeps 5-6 hours a night and always has. So clearly he's got, an hour or two on everybody else or most people.
Right.
And he, this cultivating of friendships was really surprising to me. He's much more complex in terms of family and friends relationships, and always thinking several steps ahead in what his next thing is. I mean, I got to be honest, he's got a lovely place where he lives. He has the coolest animals, Lulu and Whiskey, the mini donkey, the mini horse. He has a little pig now. And I think he's going to turn 76 in a couple of weeks. I think I'd be like, okay, I did all these crazy things, but what is he doing? He's launching a new app. Of course, it's called The Pump, and they're like, why didn't anyone do this previously? But that's coming out. He's got a self-help book because people like his philosophy. And he just doesn't give up because he truly loves working. And more than anyone I've met, and I know it's like second or third time I said this, he loves being an American,
Right.
At this time of this fractured society, like, he hasn't lost that part of his vision. And it's really surprising. But the other thing is Arnold the Flawed is also a part of his layers. And he went there in the series, and we agreed nothing was off the table, but he went there, and he knew he had to talk about those things. He did talk about those things, and some of those things he's never going to talk about again. But he recognizes these somewhat significant flaws.
Yeah, and I think we'll be talking more about some of those probably later on in our chat together. I think actually I was gonna. Well, let's hold off on giving a break, but let's. I think another part of the mantra that also comes to mind that kept coming up was something from his father, which was do something useful, right? So that's kind of factored in this as well. And maybe gets back to this point that he just doesn't turn it off. He's still working.
Yeah, and I have to tell you, normally I'd shy away from those pithy statements, right? Because you're like, okay, we can handle a couple each episode. But it's kind of like, can you really put it all in a neat little bow like that?
Yeah.
But he's got like 10 of them, and they haven't changed in 40 years, So I think part of the responsibility you have as a filmmaker is not to soften those things. And with Arnold, we wanted to give you some of what because that really is him. It's not like he has this completely different persona off screen or when he's not governing, and he absolutely is different. He's much, I think, smarter than the characters he chooses to play in all these movies would lend itself to believe. In fact, he's most like the character in Twins.
Yeah. That's
of
what he
any
says.
role, And I would say, I don't know what he would say. I think he'd probably say kindergarten cop, but he's really most like that, with just this glaring optimism. And I think that with him leaving some of those out, even though some of them I'm like, this again.
Right.
He walks around talking to his animals that way when no one's around, because we came over early one morning to film him because he has this routine, and I was like, I need to, film some of these basic things. And my camera and sound guy, it was just us, we're waiting around the corner, and I come around and he's like having a conversation with his animals, as himself saying these things. So, you have to decide, I have to be authentic to how the character really is.
And in terms of that authenticity, I mean, we're also kind of started this off about talking about how, how do you go about making a film about someone who we all think we already know? I mean, is this also an opportunity? I mean, not that you see it so explicitly like this, but is this an opportunity to sort of debunk myths or misconceptions, whether positive or negative, about an individual? Or is it, or do you even look at it that way? It's more just, let's start unpeeling these layers and let's see who comes out.
I think I always love, I think a lot of filmmakers do. I love debunking myths, right? Where there are actually myths. And I think the construct, everyone has these formative childhood years, but because he lived in a place of such pristine beauty, but humble, the only reason their house looked as nice as it did is because it was free, because his father was a police commissioner. So they lived on the second floor. What we say in the US is the second floor.
Right.
And the forester lived on the first floor, and he grew up in this idyllic area across from this crumbling castle, and he could walk to that lake, where he works out. But he had an abusive, unpredictable father who taught him discipline. But we had this scene where there were only a handful of photos. There's lots of photos later, but from Arnold's childhood, that was a time where not a lot of photos were being taken, right? He was in 47, and certainly not by, families of little means in their case. And, when he told me a ton of childhood stories, but there were two that really stuck with me. One's not ultimately, when they talk about killing your darlings, one of my favorite scenes is not in the film. But this idea that the father would have the brothers compete against each other for attention. And when Mother's Day was coming up, his father said, you go out and go hiking and pick flowers and we'll see who has the best bouquet. We'll see who wins. Right. I mean, that's weird, right?
Exactly.
And
yeah.
I mean, I don't want to pass too much judgment, but that's a strange way. Like, go pick your mother's flowers is nice. Who can do it better when one kid is taller and older and like, it's weird. So we went to the area where he picked the flowers from and we shot at the time of the year where they were blooming. And, it's always great, when you're directing something and you can shoot in the real locations in the documentary, and you can't do it for everything, but when you can, that forest scene in episode 1 was the real forest, he went through to get to the bus to pick up his older brother. So these childhood formative things were really, really indelibly marked or scarred. And he would slip into talking about them. And then a minute or two later, he would justify them, the neighbor's kids were also being hit or the teacher was hitting people.
That's right.
But he has these little tells, every once in a while, like one eyebrow is slightly different than the other when he's really thinking something and he'll look a certain way. And I think with someone who has as many talking points as someone who was governor and a great promoter of films,
right?
You have to keep going and going and going and going until you finally get to what's, you peel the onion, like you were saying, until you finally get to that other layer.
Yeah. And what was this favorite scene that you end up on the cutting room floor?
So the banana story. So he does, it's still in there. We preserve that. Well, how to phrase this? When he was younger, he was sick a lot. He caught everything. And his brother, who was only a year older, seemed to have a better stamina. But he got sick and was in the hospital once for 6 weeks. And at that time, he had another little boy that was in the room with him, but his parents weren't allowed to come in. So he would walk up to the window and wave to his parents, who would be 2 stories down below.
Right. And
the kid in the bed next to him was a little better off, and his parents would send bananas up to him, and the kid would get one banana. And Arnold was like, "What is that?"
Yeah, because they were luxury items back then.
You don't know what a banana is? And he had never had a banana. And he asked the kid for some of the banana, and the kid wouldn't share, but he gave Arnold the banana peel. So he scraped off the inside of the banana peel with his teeth.
Oh my God.
And it's just hard to believe, And so we did kind of, I'm allergic to the word recreation because I like to do more impressionistic things.
Right.
And especially if they're people's memories. And so we did an original photography scene with that was really touching, but it had to go in the end. So that was sad.
Well, it's an interesting story. There must be so many. I mean, just generally, not even this film.
Yeah.
You always have so many of these. I can imagine. What's the last thing that gets cut from a film?
I know. And it's always whether you're just trying to keep up a pace or, my philosophy is to edit musically.
Okay.
And so it's a little bit of a twist on a variation on what Walter Murch says. I think he says something like cut with rhythm or
right.
That kind of thing. But I always I do playlists for each episode before we cut. And I'm not saying, and I give them to the editors, and I'm not saying use these songs. I'm saying this is what I have in my head. And they could be from various time periods. Yeah. And usually it's like a couple current day songs and then something vintage. Like I always try and do something personal, something vintage, something classic, and then a song I didn't know that maybe just put me in the place. And usually it's things I'm finding while I'm in my car, right? And so I make a playlist, the music supervisor pulls it, and then we all kind of have that. But what I mean by editing musically is find whatever the rhythm is of that scene and go with it. And then I like to turn off the music and make sure the scene works without music, because a lot of it's really tempting to cheat.
Right.
You know, music is so important, and I'm my cinematographers laugh because I'm so picky about visuals, but visuals don't matter if you don't have good sound and the right music or no music on key scenes. I think audiences really respond to what is going on, what they're hearing, more so than they realize it. I mean, we have examples all the time. You can see some crappy looking footage on YouTube, but it's really good because you can hear what's going on, and it's just a great story, you know?
Right. I think that brings us to a really good point to give our listeners a quick break. So we'll be right back with Lesley Chilcott, the award-winning filmmaker behind Arnold, docu-series now streaming on Netflix.
You're listening to Factual America. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at Alamo Pictures to keep up to date with new releases or upcoming shows. Check out the show notes to learn more about the program, our guests, and the team behind the production. Now back to Factual America.
Welcome back to Factual America. I'm here with Lesley Chilcott, the award-winning filmmaker behind Arnold, which is now streaming on Netflix, certainly top here in the UK. I think our discussion took an interesting turn towards bananas and music, even though we're talking about the maybe world's greatest action hero of all times, potentially. I mean, getting back to him, so your first episode's about the athlete, and a lot of that is about the discipline and everything that set him up for what was to come. And you've already mentioned he's born in Austria, made in America. But then he becomes an actor, and he's not just satisfied with being in the movies. He wants to be the leading man. I mean, that is, and at a time, you've already talked about what was going on in the 70s, and Pacino and Hoffman. These guys were slight of stature, which I'm happy with, since being one myself. But he was just out of left field that he wanted to do this, and yet, lo and behold, he achieves it.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. Even when he first met with James Cameron, which was one of our most important, if not our most important interview, because they haven't just worked together. James Cameron truly knows the real Arnold, and Arnold's tight with a handful of people. Unfortunately, his best friend, Franco, passed a few years ago. And that would have been really something, to be able, to get, we tried to bring him in other ways, but he was such a great friend and such an interesting human that would have been nice. But James Cameron really knows him and has really influenced Arnold's career. I mean, for me personally, when Terminator came out, that dystopian view of the future was so seared in my memory.
Right.
Even though it was a sci-fi movie and somewhat absurd in many ways, I just loved it, and then later you learn, oh my God, that movie was made for only $6 million. Like, how was that possible? And there's all these things kind of going on there. So, James Cameron said the first time he went and met Arnold for a lunch, that Arnold was like, I don't want to be an actor. I want to be a star. Right. And James Cameron was like, okay, buddy, like, I know you from Conan. And he had this really insightful thing, is that up to that point, Arnold had been the body. Right. And James Cameron, he talks about how the light hit his face and it fell on that jawline during their first meeting. And he's like, this guy's face is intriguing.
Right.
And the famous story is that initially he was supposed to play Reese.
Right.
And Arnold just kept talking about how the Terminator should behave. And there ended up, Arnold ends up playing the the Terminator. So, and James Cameron also, tells this story about, I think one of the most famous lines in film history with "I'll be back." And, Arnold was like, I'm a guy with an accent. I don't think I'd say all, plus I'm a machine as a show.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
The line has to be, "I will be back."
Right.
And as it was originally written in the script, it was all "come back."
Right.
Right. So Arnold just argued till he was like blue in the face. And, James Cameron was like, "Are you the fucking writer?"
Yeah. Literally, that's what he says. Yeah.
Yeah. And I could just so picture that happening. So we really needed those stories, because the challenge with the actor episode is, Arnold's been in over 70 things. Like, we can't do it justice.
Right.
And I'm like, everybody's going to be like, "Where's this movie?" Or why isn't there more on Total Recall, or whatever it is.
Or Kindergarten Cop.
So, what's that?
Or even Kindergarten Cop, which I don't know if I remember seeing a scene from Kindergarten. Like you said, there's just all these different movies.
Yeah. Of course, there was a scene with Kindergarten Cop that was quite long, as was, all these other things, like both the joy and, my first love is feature documentaries. And what I love about series is you can actually do a deeper dive,
right.
But then you still have this construct of these hour-long, whether they're 45 minutes or an hour and 2 minutes or whatever they are, episodes, that you still have the same challenges, right?
Right.
You just have to have 3 complete arcs instead of,
Right.
So a lot of times, and riffing on that same topic that you brought up, when we got to the governor, there's no way we could cram 7 years of him being governor into 30 minutes of episode 3, right?
Right.
So it had to be more about his governing style and how different he was, and how he rewired the brains of his staff to not recognize obstacles and all of that. So sorry, I'm rambling.
No, you're not rambling. That's a nice segue. But before we actually talk about him as the politician, the thing that struck me about there's a lot of things that strike me throughout all the whole docu-series, but in that one about the actor, the James Cameron stories, you're right, are just incredible. And yet, as I think I mentioned earlier before, what I picked up on in the cultural zeitgeist, if you will, at the time was, here's this dumb jock bodybuilder guy who just did Conan the Barbarian, and who, this is so typical of Hollywood that this guy becomes a movie, a big star. But that couldn't be further from the truth, as you show. He's like, obviously he took advantage of the fact that he had a certain body type and things, but he does acting lessons. He does all these things to better himself, to achieve what he's trying to become. And as you said, what's that? He trains. Yes.
With everything that he does, he trains. And it sounds like such a basic concept, but even while we were filming the documentary, Fubar came into the picture, and he, we would show up, or I did a lot of audio only interviews with him, without camera and lights, to sort of try and get past the talking points.
Right.
And sometimes I would show up and he would be there with his acting coach, reading the script, running lines, and he did it for months and months, so he really does train and study. And the fact that he and Stallone were running neck and neck, although Arnold is always physically supersized compared to Stallone and most people.
Yeah.
At the height of all that, after Predator, Commando, like all of that, he was like, yeah, comedy,
Well, yeah.
I'm going to try comedy because, I know I'm funny, maybe nobody else, his friends knew, but like the public didn't know that. And it's such a risk. And, I think the essential mystery of Arnold is, did he see the trend coming and pivot, like action and comedy? Like, did he somehow 6 years early know he was going to make True Lies?
Right.
Did he set the trend, or did he just ride the wave? And
right.
A good friend of his, Paul, always says, I've known Arnold for 40 years, and he sees around corners, and I don't know how he does it, And I don't know what's planned versus what isn't, even though I talk to him almost every day. And so an example of that would be in 2003, he did Terminator 3. He got paid $30 million. And then the recall happens and he runs for governor. So, I mean, was he poised and ready to go? Could he have predicted the recall? Like, did he make 30 million because he knew for 7 years he wasn't going to be earning those box office dollars? But no one could have predicted the recall. Right. And yet that was how he won, because there wasn't a traditional Republican primary, And so it's kind of like, one of my personal philosophies about documentaries is like each film is its own puzzle, right? And you put all the pieces together and there's not a script. So you're putting all the pieces together, but do you complete the puzzle or do you leave a couple pieces out so that the audience can fill in those pieces however, they wish? And Arnold is kind of like that. He's that kind of a puzzle,
Yeah.
And it kind of this voyage that you go on to, for me, that Marcel Proust quote, that's the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. So Arnold seems like familiar territory, right? So how do we look at this differently? And how do we get, he didn't have control, but he gave us access. So how do you get your subject to show you those other sides? That's one challenge, which we've talked about. But then how do you take this massive body of work and cram it into an hour? Like you can't get all the puzzle pieces in. No. Right?
Exactly. Or it would be a 5,000 piece puzzle. It's like, to take the analogy way too far. But I mean, it's I mean, but well, you actually mentioned just something briefly. I wanted to touch. You mentioned something earlier that to get beyond the talking points or whatever, you did audio only interviews. Is that? I mean, I know some people are doing a political doc actually, and it's this issue. Yeah. The person they're interviewing is always on message. Always has the same 5-6 points they're hammering on at the time. And have you found that a good tool to get beyond that? I mean, there's other things you try to do to get that person to be less off message, less on message, I should say. But is that a helpful tool?
For me, it is. Everyone has their own methods. Like a lot of people believe really strongly in the pre-interview, but for me, I get frustrated if I do a pre-interview, because even if I interview them a month later, the subject acts like we've already had this conversation, exactly. Yeah. Especially if they're a regular person, like as I've said, or like I said before, or, because everybody's polite, so they throw in these things. So I like to start out with, hey, here's a couple subjects we're going to cover today. And, I don't give any questions. I don't even use my own questions. I put them away and we just have a conversation. But way back when we were making An Inconvenient Truth, Davis and I, finally in the 7th interview with Al Gore, we got off the talking points. And then near the end of the documentary, we did this interview when Al was staying at a hotel in Santa Monica that was just Davis, me, and the sound guy. Right. And that interview, which went on so long that the sun set outside. Right. And Al ends up slumped in his chair like this, is this ever going to freaking end? Right. That's half the audio that's used. And so it was a real lesson, especially if someone's been a politician, to get them off of, because, we all have talking points. Politicians have official talking points. Right. Right. And so I find that really helpful. And what I do is I just bring my own sound equipment over, and it's not just my phone. It's decent sound equipment. And we do a whole series of interviews. And honestly, even if you don't, we used a lot of it, but even if you don't, you've built a different relationship with that person. Right. That can inform your next interview. So I don't know. I mean, it works for me.
Okay. So we've been talking a lot about Arnold and the project and the film, but how did this come about? How did you become involved?
I got a call from Alan Hughes, our executive producer, and he had seen a 6-part series that I did called Helter Skelter, an American Myth, to your point about myths.
Right.
And he really liked the way that I approached the original photography in that he sort of has a similar view of me that, some recreations can be very cheesy, as he says.
Right.
And he's like, I think you'd be perfect for this. And I'm thinking, okay, how did you make that transition? Tell me more,
Exactly.
a series about a cult too.
Right.
So, and he had a similar approach, when thinking about the idea of Arnold as a series, we were like, wait a second, what's not out there? Especially because he's been so public. I'm so sorry, excuse me.
No worries.
One sec. So that was the start of it. And Alan, Alan felt that Netflix was the perfect home because Arnold is such an international star. We wanted somewhere with a huge international presence, and you go anywhere in the world and it's like people know Bob Marley, they know Marilyn Monroe, and they know Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Right.
Yeah.
And was Arnold initially receptive? Obviously he's become very receptive. He's very involved. A lot of time on camera.
He was. I think he'd been approached a lot, especially over the last 5 years, and I don't think he was ready. I think he had to get to that point,
right,
when he was ready to potentially, go to that vulnerable place. He's always had a ton of press coverage, but people know that when you make a documentary about them, this can get very personal, and you have to talk about, like we had to deal with him, that, like I said, that nothing was off the table. And I think, as he was approaching his 75th birthday, I think he finally thought, okay, it's time. And, in the beginning, we got these little windows, where we could shoot. And I chose to interview him in his home office.
Right.
So I could get a half hour more here and there, and he didn't have to go anywhere, and he'd feel comfortable, Yeah. And he was game right from the beginning. I do a terrible Arnold accent, but, we wanted to do, Logan Schneider, my DP, and I wanted to do a camera test because we thought, okay, this one interview is going to be the anchor piece of this. And quite honestly, we did it because with Arnold being a film star, we wanted to test anamorphic lenses versus spherical, right?
Right.
And when we did the test with and different lighting setups as well, we both knew we were going to shoot area large format because it, first of all, I think it's an amazing camera. And we use these brand new lenses that weren't out yet, the signature, I don't know if you want to get into this, but we use the signature zoom lenses.
Okay.
And we had to keep borrowing the beta versions because they weren't out yet, which became its own drama. Arnold's only available this day, and the lens is in Iceland. So can it, come back to us? But the large format really isolated Arnold in the room to help reflect the big personality that he is. And the test with the anamorphic lenses was beautiful, but it felt like we were in a movie.
Right.
And in terms of visual language, I wanted people to feel that I was asking him questions, and this is a documentary. So we went with, spherical, and I'm happy with the choice. But, besides the artistic reasons we chose that and the location, it was right at his house, and he came in for the test. And I had moved this couch so that it was closer to camera. And it was like this big Chippendale style couch. And it looked super cool. And it was his office. And he sits down and he's like, couches cause you to slouch. Slouching is a loser position. I'm always leaning forward. I need to lean forward. And the entire crew, which was small, was just like, oh my God, who is this guy? And, we had brought a chair specifically for him to sit in, and I just liked the couch better. And, so out goes the couch, in comes the chair, he sits back down. But I mean, if we had an interview time with him at 9 a.m., we were ready at 8:45 because he walks through the door at 9 a.m. and he sits down and he goes, what do you want to know?
Right.
And then I would plan things for the rest of the day. And he's like, is that it? Are we going to do anything else? And I'm like, oh, I have you for more time. And he's like, you do. I'm like, great. We're going to do this. And he's just like, he really is, someone who doesn't tire. He tires a little bit now that he's getting older. And after some of the interviews, he was emotionally spent and we couldn't do much else that day. But most of the time, I'm like, can we come next time you're at your tank? And he's like, yes, and he's a ball of energy.
Wow. I mean, it gets to this point of, well, it's as with any documentary, and especially when you're filming someone like Arnold, is, does he think he is he treating it as if he's in a movie, right? In terms of performance and things. But I like this, what's this Austrian German word he uses a lot? Schmäh, yeah. I mean, that was it, because even I think you play it twice, or it's reference to it twice, but even the thing he said in Pumping Iron, and then he says later, oh, well, I just said schmäh. I was just, it's the best English translation you can come up with is bullshit or BS. It's just kind of, but you have to have it, to get in life, and it was a very interesting, I think that was another aspect to him that, at least for me, is I didn't have an appreciation for.
Yeah. And not my choice, honestly. That was something that Alan Hughes felt very strongly about, because Arnold kind of revealed that in some early discussions.
Right.
But for the reason that you said, because Arnold likes to say it's all bullshit, and yet to him, it's not.
Right, exactly.
So I didn't want that to be conflicting information.
Right. Yeah.
But this experience you have with Arnold when you're off camera, and he loves to tell you inside baseball, right? And we wanted to provide that inside baseball experience. But Arnold is always selling. He's always selling.
Right.
And he's always selling when no cameras are around. It's like that David Mamet movie, ABC, Always Be Closing, right? I don't know if you saw that, but
no, I've seen that. Yeah.
Yeah, that really is him. Yet he has this whole plan and strategy that goes into it. Yeah. So in a way, showing that fits in with, showing the Arnold we know, and then later you see the Arnold, that we don't know.
Yeah. And then, I mean, because we're actually coming close to the end of our time, and like your film, and as you've already talked about having such a huge subject, we're not going to be able to touch on everything here. And, there's so much to the film, so many layers, and people just need to go watch it, to be honest, is what I would suggest. But there's this thing. So we've got athlete, actor, politician, or episode 3 is called American. And even I think says it, he recognizes that there are things that have happened in his life that could overshadow that, and could possibly lead him, that are going to affect his legacy, and people are going to remember him for maybe something else. Right. And you've had to, and as you said, you've dealt with those. I mean, how did you deal with that yourself and personally? Because there are these allegations that came up during the gubernatorial race, and the LA Times articles that they ran about accusations from more than just a handful of women. And how was that aspect of I mean, you did make them address it. Yeah.
And it's interesting because there are whole segments of the documentary that are clearly from Arnold's point of view,
Yeah.
Arnold's point of view on how his family reacted when he ran for governor, and those kinds of things. And I think those are great because you get his take on things. But when it came to the accusations in particular, I wanted another point of view. I interviewed
Yeah.
3 different LA Times reporters, and 2 of them, Mark Barabeck and Joe Matthews, the whole time Arnold was governor, wrote highly critically of him. But even those 2 were won over by his sheer dedication and the amount of things he tried, even if they failed. Because as a governor, you have a lot of failures and you have some successes, right? But Carla Hall from the Los Angeles Times, both on and off camera, shared with me how they really, truly investigated these allegations. And when they reported them, she couldn't believe that it immediately went political. And Arnold at the time even gives a speech that says, where there's smoke, there's fire, and he hints at owning up to it. In the documentary, he flat out says, what I did was wrong, right?
Yep. Right.
And so the approach to that was, it certainly wasn't the first interview,
Right.
And we did a lot of interviews. And at that point, Alan and I went to him and were like, next Friday is the day. We need to address this then. And he trusted us at that point. But not only, and Carla Hall is very candid, that there was the first article, and then there were 15, 16 women in the next article, and that it wasn't just a one-off by any means. And then we did the same thing with the affair. And he really explains, the viewer has to hold 2 ideas in their head. One, Arnold had an affair, did something horrible to his family. On the other hand, there's a 25-year-old adult man that is the son from that relationship, who's wonderful. And as a parent, you can't say I made a mistake, because you have a human.
Right.
And while I'm not saying he deserves empathy for that, that is a conundrum to think about what you do in that situation. And why he doesn't talk more about it is only because he doesn't want to hurt his family. But he's very aware that as much as he's remembered, or will be remembered, for all of these successes, everyone knows that story as well.
Yeah. And whatever he wanted to achieve, I don't know, did he ever say anything about, what could have been? I don't know if he would have been able to run for president, given that he was born in the United States, but...
He wasn't able to run. I think he would have really considered it in 2016 if constitutionally he couldn't run. But I asked him multiple times on off camera, what's the current goal, or what did you miss? He really, he climbs that peak, and then he sees all the other peaks he hasn't climbed. And, one of my favorite parts of the documentary, and maybe this will answer your question, is, to have gone from The Body, 13 international awards. And he's like, what is this? What is this little thing below my rib? It's like fat. Should I have it surgically removed? What should I do about this?
Yeah.
That's like, the rest of us are like, I'm still trying to get in shape, right? And and he's fallen so, far physically. But then that same person says, my body wasn't, I don't care what the Guinness Book of World Records says, or all these things. I was never perfect. I never got there. I'm like, oh my God, how are the rest of us supposed to feel?
I know.
And it's an interesting perspective.
I know. And also, he does say too, he's 75. He's just now, he's come to grips with it, and he's just trying to hold on.
He's just trying to hold on, but during the course of the film, he developed a new philosophy, probably completely unrelated to what we were doing. Is, well, let me back up. If I were to summarize Arnold personally, after knowing him now and making this project, and I'm completely ripping this off from a journalist that I think is amazing called Tom Junod, but he talks about the ongoing comedy of Arnold's limitlessness.
Right.
And you think that he's done, and now he's got a series, and he's got the app, as I mentioned, and there might be a little side project with Lulu and Whiskey being stars in it. And there's like No, I'm not kidding. It's like crazy. There was a script, there's all this stuff going on. But to me, it's the ongoing comedy of his limitless aspirations that are just, it's endlessly fascinating.
Completely agree. And I think we're going to have to leave it there, though. I'm going to sneak one last question in because I know we're getting a warning about you've got another appointment. But what's next for you after this film?
Another pivot. I'm doing a documentary that takes a look at the new American West and how it clashes with our traditional ideas of the American West, of dominion over land, animals, and all of these things. And I think during the pandemic, we all kind of realized or re-realized the importance of wild spaces and wildlife corridors and Yellowstones and those things. So I'm looking at the wolf and using the wolf as a portal into talking about all these controversial land preservation issues.
Wow. Well, we look forward to that. And I think as your IMDb profile says, you do not like to be categorized or limited. So you're moving in something to that effect. But no, we definitely look forward to that. And would love to have you on again once that project's dropped, if we haven't scared you off. And so just to remind our listeners, we've been talking with Lesley Chilcott, the award-winning filmmaker behind Arnold. Really don't need to say anything more except that it's streaming on Netflix. Lesley, thank you so much for joining us on Factual America. It's been a pleasure. We hope you enjoyed that episode of Factual America. If you did, please remember to like us and share us with your friends and family, wherever you happen to listen or watch podcasts. I would also like to thank those who make this podcast possible. A big shout out to Sam and Joe at Inner Sound Audio in York, England. A big thanks to Amy Ord, our podcast manager at Alamo Pictures, who makes sure we continue getting great guests onto the show and everything runs smoothly. And finally, a big thanks to you, our listeners. Many of you have been with us for 4 incredible seasons. Please keep sending us feedback and episode ideas, whether it is on YouTube, social media, or directly by email. This is Factual America, signing off.
You've been listening to Factual America. This podcast is produced by Alamo Pictures, specializing in documentaries, television, and shorts about the USA for international audiences. Head on down to the show notes for more information about today's episode, our guests, and the team behind the podcast. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Alamo Pictures. Be the first to hear about new productions, festivals showing our films, and to connect with our team. Our homepage is alamopictures.co.uk.